this will not be the end of this discussion. People will continue to debate this psalm without a doubt, and that's okay. But I will give you my pondering, and I think that'll be just that. Now, Asaph is the Levite, the son of Berechiah. He's a choir director at the time of King David, 1 Chronicles 6:39. And a number of psalms are attributed to him, and some of them are indeed by him. Others are by another Asaph at a later time. So, but Psalm 50 to 73 and 83 all carry his name. And so I do think that it's the seer that is, in this case, that is writing this. And so it would be written at the time of David, roughly about 950 BCE, give or take a year. And 2 Chronicles 29:30, he is a seer, he's a prophet. And so despite the troubles that we'll have in interpreting this, all scripture is inspired by God, 2 Timothy 3:6, so it's worthy of our perspiration, though we don't have the same inspiration as God. So who or what is Elohim? Asaph states clearly that Elohim is stationed or standing in the congregation of El. And he declares of these Elohim that they fail to promote justice on the earth. A plain reading would see God standing in the heavenly courtroom, accusing other Elohim. Now, they can't be gods, though the word is used of gods of the other nations. But there is only one God. We don't doubt that. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So how does this Elohim cast judgment on the other Elohim? And as I said, it does look like a courtroom reading, and God's stance is also seen in Isaiah 3, verse 13, or Isaiah 33:10, and that's clearly judgment language. And so he's judging these Elohim. I don't think he's addressing pagan deities as though they are deities. I think he's acknowledging that they're angelic beings who administer God's justice and control over the nations on behalf of the Lord, on behalf of Yahweh. I believe the Apostle Paul also mentions these judges a few times in Romans 8, verse 38, Ephesians 3, verse 10, Colossians chapter 1 and 2 as well. These are angelic beings who do things on earth. They're administrators, they function as powers, dominions, magistrates, or principalities, and who do things or should do things according to the will of God. And so they ought to bring some relief and from injustice and the brutality of life. Having said that, the most common interpretation of this psalm in most churches and synagogues today is that God stands in the congregation of judges. These are human judges who minister the affairs of mankind. And that's because this skates too close to Canaanite multi-god kind of thing. Like both in Egypt and Assyria, you had the supreme God, the creator of gods, the God of gods, and then you had the lower deities. And particularly if you read the Book of the Dead, which we don't, but we read the Book of Life. But the Egyptian Book of the Dead describes that very clearly. But you see it also on the walls of the tombs of the various kings in Egypt. There's the supreme God, and then there's the lower gods. These are the pantheon of gods. So there's the lower gods. But there is no God like you among the gods. Psalm 84 clearly does, Psalm 86 does seem to indicate that there are other beings called God. And so who are these? What is the pantheon of gods, of Elohim? And are there other gods? But the word Elohim, and that's why I've given you that, is the common term used for God. It's not his name. usually we say it means God or gods, but it is also used of other beings, and so it's used, for instance, of holy angels and of fallen angels. There's the gods of the nations who are really the fallen ones themselves, and Satan himself is called the God or the ruler of this world in 2 Corinthians 4, verse 4. But he's also the prince of the world, John 12:31, John 14:30, John 16:11. So clearly there is something here that is bigger than that. But biblically speaking, I think there are only two groups that are referred to as Elohim. Yahweh, the true God, and he's called the God of gods. Deuteronomy 10, verse 17, Psalm 136:2, Daniel chapter 2 and 11. And that's the majority of the cases. But over 200 times, the Bible describes other beings as Elohim, and they're the angels. Both the holy angels, Psalm 8, verse 5, and this is clearly an angel that's being described there. You've made him a little lower than God in some translations, but it's quoted in Hebrews chapter 2, verses 7 and 9, as angels. And so, despite the fact that the New American and the version I like keep saying God, Scripture must interpret Scripture. There's what Dr. Heiser, Michael Heiser, who died last year, said. There's the member of the Divine Council, and we see that in this psalm, but we also see it in the book of Job in chapters 1 and 2, where God calls these angels together and they talk to him. But within that council, we also see fallen angels, because Satan is standing amongst them. And so it seems that the divine council of God that is being pulled together includes both fallen and holy angels. Based on Job 1:6 and 2 verse 1, these fallen angels then have some authority. Now, generally, fallen angels masquerade as the gods of the nations, Exodus 12, verse 12, Judges 16, etc., etc. Or sometimes they're just called plainly demons, shadim. Now, the oldest translation of this psalm clearly says that they are angels, and that's the Targum, the Aramaic translation. And in verse 6, it says, you are reckoned as angels, all of you.
Paul, is this where when Satan is referred to as the God of this world, is it the same sort of context or interpretation?
Well, he calls himself the God of this world, and he's called the ruler of this world by Jesus. So I think it is the same kind of language that we see. And within the book of Daniel, we see that they do have authority over nations. And so that would fit very well with that. So I do think it is they do connect up. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
So the biblical word Elohim is therefore better, as Michael Heiser described, as indicating where they are living or where their origin is. And he explains that Adam, from Adamah, from the earth, so we are earthlings, but these are beings that come from the other realm, from the heavenly realm. And so the ones that come from the heavenly realm are Yahweh, the true God, the God of gods, the Elohim of Elohims, or I should actually say the El of Elohims, and the angels, both the holy angels and the fallen angels. Now we'll deal with 1 Kings 22 in a minute, because that too indicates that God is using these angelic beings. If you're reading this in the King James or the Jewish Publication Society, you will note that the word Elohim also means judges. In the King James, it's translated 3 times as judges in Exodus 21, verse 6, Exodus 22, verse 8, and verse 9. And we see it in 1 Samuel 2, verse 25. In this psalm, you'll see it in verse 6, where the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society, has judges. But this is the only time it is translated as judges. And so it would seem to go contrary to what Michael Heiser is saying. Now, Jewish scholar Robert Alto, who translated the Bible into English, he's considered one of the erudite translators. He wrote this: the efforts of traditional Jewish commentators to understand Elohim here as judges are unconvincing. God speaks out in the assembly of the lesser gods and rebukes them for doing a wretched job in administrating justice on the earth, end quote. And that's his comments in his book, the Book of Psalms, a translation and commentary on Psalm 82, obviously. And so it would clearly indicate that on a plain reading, it cannot be judges. And his comments on Exodus 21 and 22, it says, then you shall bring the slave that wants to be a perpetual slave to you, and you bore his a hole through his ear. Literally says you shall bring him before God. It doesn't need to be the judges. And so Michael Heiser is probably right that it's probably more that these come from the other realm. Now, I don't agree with everything he says, but I think he's kind of right there. Now, in the first century, the rabbinic view was that these were fallen angels. However, from the 2nd century onwards, we see that the rabbinic view changes, and the rabbinic view at that point becomes, no, this cannot be about angels, because then we recognize there are other gods, and we don't want that. So whatever this means, it doesn't mean that. So at that point, they created a different opinion, and that became the common opinion even in the church today, and that's that they are judges. So on this, they will say, if 10 men pray together, the divine presence, the Shekhinah of God, is with them. For it is said, God stands in the congregation of God. And how do we know that if 3 are sitting together as a court of judges, the divine presence is with them? For it says, in the midst of the judges, he judges. But it didn't say judges. It said, in the midst of the Elohim, he judges. And so in Berachot 6a, where I quote from, it clearly is trying to say, this is not that. The same in the Sanhedrin, which is also part of the Talmud. Rabbi Nachman reported that Jonathan said, a judge who delivers judgment in the perfect tense, causes the Shekhinah to dwell in Israel. For it is written, God stands in the congregation of God, and in the midst of the judges, he judges. And so they deliberately moved away from the literal reading of the words. And the problem is, when you ignore the literal reading, it can mean anything. And so, as uncomfortable as our conclusion will be, it is, in my opinion, better to stick to the literal reading. Now, there is a small group who believe that this is speaking about the Trinity, because God, he is a triune being. So it's the Father standing amongst the other beings of the Trinity. In other words, the Son and the Holy Spirit. But that's complete heresy, and so I don't even want to go there, because he is judging them for doing something unrighteously. So that is not true. Whatever this means, it cannot be that. Now, in Psalm 89, verses 5 to 7, Psalm 89, verses 5 to 7, it says, the heavens will praise your wonders, O Yahweh, your faithfulness also in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the sky is compared to Yahweh? And who amongst the sons of the mighty is like Yahweh? Our God greatly feared in the council of the holy ones, and awesome above all those who are around him. Here too we see an assembly, a council of holy ones together with Yahweh. Now, it cannot be Israel in the context, and the skies are the heavens. And so who is compared to God in the heavens? Well, who amongst the sons of the mighty, a reference to the angels, is like Yahweh? In other words, no one. These are not earthly saints, these are holy angels. Now, does God need a council? No, he has all knowledge and power, and he doesn't need it. But he uses angels to govern the earth, just as he doesn't need Adam, but he used Adam to subdue and rule the earth. And so he uses them for his own purpose. And that's clearly seen also in 1 Kings 22, verses 19 to 22, where God uses a really interesting thing. He uses the prophet Micaiah to give a word, and he says this, 1 Kings 22, verse 19. Micaiah said, "Therefore hear the word of Yahweh. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by him, and on his right hand and on his left hand. The Lord said, who will entice Ahab to go up and fall at Ramat Gilead? And one said to one another, and one said this while another said that. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, I will entice him. The Lord said, how? And he said, I will go out and be a deceiving spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. Then he said, you are to entice him and also prevail. Go and do so. The first thing to point out that God is sitting there on his throne, and all the host of heaven are standing by. Again, we have the counsel of God. But in this passage, God is using a spirit, one of the heavenly hosts, an angel, to entice Ahab. He's clearly using an evil spirit, a lying spirit, to accomplish his purpose. Now, this is not a unique problem. We see that also in the book of Job, chapters 1 and 2, where God is standing and Satan comes amongst them. And he too accuses Job. So we need to wrestle with that issue of how can God permit Satan or a lying spirit to accomplish his purpose? But that would be a sermon for a different day, not today. But it is something that we then see. We see a counsel of God, and that these beings come from heaven.
Could I just mention he was Ahab?
Yeah.
He was under judgment anyway, wasn't he?
Oh, he was. He clearly was under judgment. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that God approved of the lying spirit. And Ahab was already hardened his heart very clearly. He was under judgment. So I think that's all of that is true. Yeah. Yeah.
Paul was afflicted by a demon.
Yeah. Yeah. And
God allowed it.
Yeah, we're not quite sure that God sent him deliberately, but God allowed it to happen. Yeah.
I said aloud, yeah.
Yeah. But what about Moses then? Because wasn't Moses twice called an Elohim, a God? If so, the whole argument that I'm making would collapse. Well, not the whole argument, but part of the argument would collapse. Twice Moses is labeled as an Elohim. First, Moses is the voice of God to his own brother in Exodus 4:16. Moreover, he shall speak for you to all the people, and he will be as a mouth for you, as you will be a mouth, and as you will be as God to him. Aaron is clearly the voice for Moses, and Moses is the voice of God. But the key word is as. And so he is like God. He is not God. And so at best, he is the voice of God. Secondly, Moses is like God to Pharaoh, because Pharaoh also had rejected the Lord when he said, who is Yahweh, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go, Exodus 5:5. And so Moses speaks on behalf of God, and he's the voice of God in the court of Pharaoh, Exodus 7:1. So reading carefully, Moses could be better labeled as the voice for God, not that he is God, but that he is like God. It is clear that Yahweh never calls Moses a God in the same sense that he himself is God. Rather, Yahweh is saying Moses will represent him to Pharaoh and to the Israelites, so that he will come in the authority of God. Well, there's one more problem with this text, and that's in John 10, because doesn't John 10, 34 to 36 say it's about the judges? This is in a context where the Pharisees are trying to accuse him and they want to stone him, and there's a whole lot happening. And in verse 34 to 36, Yeshua answered them and said, "Is it not written in your law, I said, you are gods?" If he called them gods to whom the word of God came and the scriptures cannot be broken, do you say of him whom the Father consecrated and sent into the world, you are blaspheming because I said, I am the Son of God? Yeshua is making the biblical argument of how much more, what the rabbis call for Homer or kal for Homer. You see it a lot in the book of Hebrews, from light to heavy, meaning from the greater to the lesser. And so if in any sense these angelic beings could be called God, how much more should Yeshua be called the Son of God? I don't see that he's deviating from the interpretation that the Elohim are angels in this psalm that he's quoting, though almost every commentary assumes that he's saying to them, you are gods, but he's not saying that. He's just quoting the text. Is it not written? And then he quotes God saying, I said you are gods. So I don't think he is deviating, because if he does, he would open the door to them being little gods. And that would be the heresy of Mormonism and the heresy of the hyper-charismatic and the woolly end of I was going to say the blab and grab it, but what are they called? The Word of Faith movement. Thank you. I knew it would come to me. So I don't take it that he's being ironic or that like, because it's hard to read those kind of things into the text when it doesn't quite clearly state it. I think he's just taking the statement as is. These are the angelic beings that are being addressed, and he's making an application at best, saying just as they, so you, rather than saying you are gods. Though I am aware that almost every commentary argues in reverse and says, based on this, he's talking about judges. But if he's talking about judges, he does open the door for us being little gods. And I think that's really not where we want to go. No. So with all of that in the background, let's look at this psalm. Elohim takes his stand in the council of El, or in the congregation of El. He judges in the midst of the Elohim. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Selah. Yahweh stands, as I said, Isaiah 3:13 and other verses. He's not seated, he is presiding over the angelic assembly. Yahweh announces his verdict that these angels who are questioned showed impartiality, showed wickedness. It shows that these angelic beings do have some powers over the nations, but have done unjustly and have favored the wicked. In verses 2 to 7, he says, vindicate the weak, the fatherless, and do justice to the afflicted and destitute. Rescue the weak, the needy, deliver them out of the hand of the wicked. They do not know, nor do they understand. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. And I said, you are gods. all of you are sons of the Most High. Nevertheless, you will die like men and fall like any of the princes. What these angelic forces should have done is protect the weak, the fatherless. God expects both human followers and angelic beings to uphold his justice for the weak, the oppressed, the poor, the orphan, the needy, not the weedy. But maybe also those that smoke a lot of pot should be protected. Anyway, but that's a different issue.
I'm curious thing, like expecting fallen angels to die.
Well, and so it's something that Sue and I discussed, and I think if you are commissioned by God, he doesn't take his gift back. And so the gift and the calling of God is not reversed. So here too, just because they are fallen doesn't mean he's revoked their gifting or their calling. And I think based on that, they still should do their job. And so that's why they still have access to the council. But I don't know. I'm still pondering this too. Like, how do you fit them in? Yeah,
How do they die like men?
I'll come to that in a second.
Makes me think of when Satan went to the throne of God in regards to Job.
Hmm,
He had
Yeah.
access still to go to God even after he'd fallen.
Yeah.
And
He
got
still
shot out
had.
of heaven.
Yeah.
He still had access to go talk to God about things. So God gave him, he was still had that relationship with God, even though he was a fallen angel. He still had that access. So if God gives him permission to go and talk to him at the throne and still talk to him as an equal, different authorities, obviously, but the fact that he obviously give fallen angels access to the council is what you're saying. So,
But he still has, because he's accusing us.
exactly.
For the
Yeah.
So it just
It's only
shows
right at the end that he's going to lose the case.
exactly. So
Exactly.
basically, when we all get judged together, everyone gets judged, even the heavenly realms. That's
Yeah.
what I'm getting. What you're saying.
Yeah.
That's why I understand.
So they still have.
That's
We all get judged too.
They're still supernatural divine beings
Yeah.
with some level of authority.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
And so these fallen angels should have spoken up for the marginalized, even though they are fallen. Angels are not only powerful, they're also influential. These angels have direct access to God. And as such, they should use their influence to advocate for the oppressed. And they can influence people. The writer of the Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews says, do not neglect showing hospitality to strangers, for in doing so, some people, without knowing it, have entertained angels. If we entertain angels, it means that they talk to us and therefore they have some influence. What I find fascinating is that God, in addressing these angels, is using the same language that we find in Obadiah verses 12 to 14. The Edomites did not look after their brothers, the Jewish people, and therefore they were judged. So here too, the angels who should look after the people are being judged. 4 times there is a clear command: vindicate, do justice, rescue, and deliver. They were to vindicate, judge in favor of the weak and the fatherless. They were to do justice on behalf of the afflicted and the destitute. They were to rescue the weak and the needy, and to deliver all of them out of the hand of the wicked. Clearly, these angelic beings have power in and over the nations, and even in their fallen estate, they should have spoken up against the injustice by declaring to God what happened to the weak, the oppressed, and by speaking on behalf of nations. If not, do more, because they could have used their power to uphold justice and rescue the weak. Exactly what authority and powers they have is a study for another day, but there is something bigger than we often think. Angels do from time to time execute God's will. We see this explicitly in Psalm 103, verse 20. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Bless the Lord, you, his angels, mighty in strength, who perform his word and obeying the voice of his word. But these angels clearly walk in darkness, indicating their fallen estate. They no longer walk by the light. As such, all the foundations of the earth are shaken. When the foundation is shaken or moved, it is a picture of unrighteousness, perversion of justice. And that's why they walk in darkness. And we see that in Proverbs 2, verse 13, Ecclesiastes 2:14. It's sometimes referring to human ignorance of righteousness, but here clearly of the angelic beings. But their lives influences kingdoms and throw them in disarray. The foundations of righteousness and justice are pillars of the throne of God, Psalm 89, verse 14. And so here the foundation of the earth is moved by lack of understanding that is brought about by perversion and darkness. In verse 6, we see the word Elyon, Most High. This is one of the names for the God of Israel. The Old Testament refers to him as the Most High in several places, and I can list them for you if you like. Numbers 24, Genesis 14, Psalm 7, etc., etc. But here the sons, plural, of the Most High are clearly the Elohim, the sons of God. And so this would indicate that these are the angelic beings. The sons of the Most High are the sons of God. Genesis 6, Job chapter 1, Job 38, verse 7. It's a clear reference to the angelic beings, and this is Hebrew poetry. One relates to the other. Psalm 82, verse 6 does not make all believers sons of the Most High. We do not become little God. That would be utter heresy, as we already mentioned. But Yahweh describes us that these Elohim, nevertheless, you will die like men and fall like any of the princes. If this was addressing human judges, there would be no threat, but this would be a powerful threat for an angelic being who once stood in the very presence of God himself. This is serious punishment. Angelic beings are to be judged after their fall, and they will experience what we would call the second death, the lake of fire. These angelic beings will be judged the great white throne judgment when Yeshua judges all unbelievers and the fallen angelic council members. As Yeshua himself said, then he will say to those on his left, you are accursed, apart from me, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels, Matthew 25:42. And at that point, they will be put into the lake of fire, Revelation 20, verses 11 to 15. Adam was created to live forever. If he had not transgressed that one commandment given to him, so too the Elohim here, the angels, like Adam, transgressed, and like Adam, therefore they must die. But they will not experience physical death, only that second death is what they will experience. And so in that sense, they will die like Adam. I take it that they walk about in darkness and die like men are both referring to the eternal punishment, therefore, that is imposed upon the wicked angels. Their punishment is like Psalm 49, verse 20, man in his pomp, yet without understanding, is like a beast that will perish. Men, like animals, to be destroyed. So here the angels will suffer that same fate as they walk about in darkness, to be eternally destroyed. It is possible that they will die like princes, that these are the cherubim, seraphim kind of level being addressed, that they too will fall like them. Satan being the arch-cherub. In verse 8 it says, arise, O God, judge the earth, for it is you who take possession of all the nations. Why does Asaph conclude with you possess all the nations? Surely back then that was true, and it's still true today. The nations were associated with different gods, different Elohim. Each nation had its patron god, a fallen angel. So Asaph concludes this psalm by calling for God to judge these Elohim that are over the nations and take control over the nations himself, over the people within it, the Goyim. And so to shake off the moral foundations that was laid by them. God will step in one day and judge and take possessions. The first time we could see that is, for instance, Armageddon. Even then, all the nations will bow their knee to enter into the Messianic kingdom. But since verse 7 is already about the lake of fire, perhaps a better point to make is at the end of the millennial kingdom, when the current heavens and earth will be destroyed, as they are all defiled, then the eternal kingdom will await, some for eternal death, the lake of fire, some for the new Jerusalem. It is at that point that he will take possession of all the nations. The righteous therefore should cry out today for mercy and for judgment to be handed down. When Yeshua the Messiah reigns in his coming kingdom, he will do so with an iron hand, Psalm 2, and he will judge the nations at that point. But the angels at that point will only be temporarily locked up until the end of the Messianic kingdom, when they'll be released. But in the eternal order, they will be permanently gone. Let me bring this to a close. The significance of this psalm, the importance of doing and ensuring justice and pursuing righteousness. While this psalm focuses on angels, this is true for people too. After all, this was written for us. All scripture is written for our benefit. And so Psalm 82 is a powerful reminder that God is the ultimate judge of angels and of people on earth, and that one day he will bring his justice to all. And so we need to apply this psalm then. And the refrain that we see over and over, particularly in the prophets, is seek justice and do righteousness. We do this by standing up for the poor, the orphan, the oppressed, the vulnerable. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17, learn to do well, seek justice, relieve the oppressed, judge the fatherless, and plead the widow. Or the most famous verse, Micah 6:8, I've told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. And so this psalm could be read as a prayer, calling upon God to do what the heavenly angels did not do, the fallen angels, namely to aid the poor, the orphan, the widow. Some of the members of the council clearly had failed. Asaph asked God to take action and judge the fallen angels for their lack of care for the inheritance of God. For God will inherit not just Israel, but all the nations, and he wants his inheritance cared for, and that is our responsibility too. But those are just some of my thoughts. There is much more that could be said. And so within the council, God himself, he's the unique being, he's the Yahweh, and there's only one of him. The sons of God, who are the princes of Daniel 10, which includes Satan, the cherubim, the seraphim, those are the higher angelic beings, and then there's the common, the messengers. And all of them stand in that council. Well, the council would be made up of the more supreme angelic beings, and Satan, we know, fell, and so it's that kind of thing that we see here. And I think it is therefore addressing the council of God, the angelic beings. So when we look at the Hebrew, God stands in the midst of the gods, but God is really standing amongst the angelic beings, and he judges them, and he calls them the sons of the Most High. And so we have a warning to us. Walk with the Lord, don't go contrary. Well, there you go.
Very good, Paul.
But as I said, there's the persistence that we hear in both commentary and both Jewish and Christian is that it's about human judges. But I think that it doesn't quite stand.
No.
But if you do hold to that, it's okay. It's a majority view, and I'm representing a minority view, but I think it'll be helpful to you.
I'm just looking at the Amplified Bible. It's basically saying human judges,
Yeah,
even though it gives reference to Romans 13:1, Revelation 11:15, and John 10:34-36. But so it's got a couple of the references there that you haven't got. But I mean, you've got a heaps. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's mainly yeah, got a lot of, it's mainly talking about human judges from there, and then in the New King James, it's a bit more. Yeah. Yeah, it's in a way it's similar to the Amplified, but I like the Amplified. It has a lot of expansion and it gives a lot of cross references. But just another way of looking at things with different Bibles.
And I
Different
think it's helpful. Yeah, it's helpful to read multiple versions because often you can see some things that you can't see in others. And so, for
Exactly
instance, the whole plurality, like the ye, the Old English you, in plural, can be seen very clearly, rather than see it as an individualistic psalm. This is addressing a group, and so that's kind of helpful when we look at that. And it's helpful to take something like the literal translation, or the Young translation, King James, American Standard, because they are quite literal, and it's helpful to know what it actually says. But the Amplified is helpful that it sometimes expands thoughts, but you got to be aware it's not a literal translation. So they do allow some the editors to allow some changes, and so it's the reason why
we love
that translation at the top to show you this is a more kind of literal translation. Yeah.
Joy and I, we love the Amplified specifically for communion verses. It has the ones that from Paul, ones from Hebrews, Psalms. There's communion verses in there. If you want to look for them, they're there. About the crucifixion of Christ, and Hebrews talks about it, Hebrews 10, Psalm 22. There's a number in Corinthians and that, but the Amplified Bible does beautiful expanded words for communion verses when you're doing communion. When you want to read, which we do, we've read communion verses when we have communion. But yeah, I just love their expanded the words they put in. I like their cross references. They put the New Testament references in the old book, and they put the Old Testament references in the new. It's makes life a lot. I mean, other Bibles have them down the side, but it actually puts them next to each passage. But yeah, every Bible's different. But I do like the Amplified in some areas, a few areas, good areas. Joy likes it. Just gives you a different perspective.
Before we get too far off on translations, are there any questions?
No.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Paul, I don't know if you mentioned this, so sorry if you did, but who the Assembly of the Gods might be, and I had a thought about Tower of Babel and the division of men according to the gods, that these being those people that he's talking about. Because I'm just trying to work out which assembly might actually be considered wicked or corrupt in relation to the way they treat the populace. And I'm thinking, if you've been handed a populace and you're not doing very well, that would be you.
Yeah. So if he's addressing humans, the threat.
No, not human.
Sorry.
I'm saying the gods. When Babel was separated, they separated according to the gods.
Yeah, and so it is possible that they are the gods of the nations. That's possible.
Yeah, that's what
so these would be the fallen angels, and so all of that's possible. Yeah, and it doesn't specify who they are or which ones they are. So I it would be beyond. It would be too much speculation on my side. But I think right from the fall, we can see that they would be involved. Yeah.
What I find really amazing about today's lesson is it makes me think about, how God's given us free will to do right and wrong. It sounds like to me that He's also given the heavenly realm free will to do right or wrong, like talking about the council of angels. Just makes me think about that. So He's given everyone really
Yeah,
It's like you think
none
God
of,
gives not only us free will, but it's also given them free will to do right and wrong. Because especially if he knows that they're doing partial things, they're not fully committed to him. And do you know what if you know where I'm coming from?
I
I could be
think
wrong.
so, yeah,
I'm only
no,
just sharing what I'm
So-
getting in my mind.
So when Satan fell in the lessons of theology that I had, they became confirmed in their unholiness.
Yeah.
Holy angels, because they followed God, that one became confirmed in their holiness,
Oh, okay.
and so they can no longer sin.
Yeah.
When Adam fell, he became confirmed in his unholiness, and so until we become sanctified,
Yeah.
and that happens at our glorification ultimately, at that point we can no longer sin.
Yeah.
So at this point we are still able to sin,
Yeah.
but fallen angels can no longer become holy angels, and holy angels can no longer become fallen angels.
Yeah.
And so it helps us understand that we should live each
Yeah.
day holy. Yeah.
100%. Yeah, I was just thinking about where you were talking about the council of the angelic
Mhm.
and the Lord judging them about their partiality.
Yeah.
In regards to what they're not doing, looking after the poor and
Mm.
the afflicted. Just made me think of that. That's how I got that concept, because I'm thinking, well, maybe he's given all of us free will. You know what I mean? Like I know
That's
for
right,
us
yeah.
that we've got to choose Jesus every day.
Mm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because we're sinners daily being saved. That's how I look at life. You know, because we'll never be perfect until we're perfected in heaven.
Until we're glorified.
Yeah, until we're glorified.
exactly.
So I was just thinking, oh well, if he's judging them for their partiality of what they're not doing, maybe sort of start to think, well, maybe they're being given free will. But as you said, once they're fallen, they're fallen. So it's important for us to make sure we choose
The end of
correctly.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, that's the only reason why I was thinking that way. Because I was just thinking just with his judgment on them in the council, thinking, yeah. So
exactly.
sorry, it's just me. I'm only sharing my thoughts. Although I don't believe it, but I was just thinking on another perspective, I guess. I was just looking at another angle of it.
Well, and as I said, this is
Yeah,
a
interesting.
pondering.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's good. It's a good pondering.
But it does make sense of the concept of the fallen beings, because Satan is the god of this world.
Mm.
So he's ruling, and there are beings ruling with him. So they're still in power here. He's got his principalities,
Yeah.
his powers, and all of that.
Yeah.
So they are doing their number on the world here. They are not being just, obviously, because they've fallen.
No.
And so it's like God's telling, but there's a time limit. You're doing unjust
Yeah.
things. You're not
Yeah.
looking after the weak and the needy,
Yeah.
as you would have done if you were not fallen.
Yeah.
So I see what you're up to, but there's a time limit and your end is coming.
Yeah.
That's what it looks like to me.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because
I like that. Yeah,
these
that makes
beings
sense.
are still ruling. Yeah, that's why the world's such a mess.
Yeah,
And
That's good.
and what he says here is that it's the wicked who are getting away with things. You're showing partiality to the wicked. That's exactly the world we're living in. The innocent people are the ones who are being victimized,
Yeah.
you know,
yeah,
and then the guilty guys are getting away with murder these days, literally in many cases. And the good people are sort of held accountable and made out to be the bad guys. You know, everything's upside down. The good have become bad, the bad are the good. And it's, well, they are ruling here. And their authority hasn't yet been taken away from them, but they're still liable for the nonsense they're getting up to down here. But it's like God at the end says, but your numbers are.
Yeah.
You will
yeah,
go into the lake of fire like you.
yeah, that's good. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
That
That
actually,
seems to
Yeah,
be
that's
the
a
gist
better-
of what
yeah.
I'm sensing here.
yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's good.
So they still divine
Yeah.
beings, they still have authority, they still have power.
Yeah.
God's
So
just
you're
calling them
giving
out, saying, you see, you're doing the wrong things. There's time for you to do something different, but you're clearly not going to do it. That's why you're going to be
Yeah.
like humans, like even like the human princes. You're going to end up like them in the lake of fire.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Because we tend to forget that
Mm.
Satan and his hordes are in control here, because things look peaceful, they look fine. But when you actually look into the wickedness that's happening to the world, what's happening to our little kids,
Yeah.
Oh gosh, yeah.
and
Correct.
how it's always the poor that get downtrodden, And the rich are getting richer and more powerful, and the good guys are being stomped on. That's sort of a picture of what's going on earth by those beings who still have authority.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that. Yeah, that's good.
Just makes a bit
I think
of,
there's a passage in
Yeah,
Revelation that says, let the wicked continue to do, let the evil continue to do evil, and let the good continue to do good or righteousness. And I think that, in a way, sums up what you're sort of
Yeah.
saying there, that that's in
exactly
Revelation,
it.
the final book.
Yep.
Yeah. So evil will continue to do evil, and righteous people will continue to do righteousness, and then the end will come. And then you're judged on your works. God will judge us on our works while we're living. So if you're the evil and you're doing evil, that's your judgment. You go to the lake of fire eventually. And then if you're doing righteousness and you're obviously saved, you'll go into heaven with Christ. And then obviously you'll come back, you'll be on the earth, but in the spirit form. So
Exactly. Yeah.
pretty, yeah.
Yeah. Let me close with a word of prayer, and then I'll ask Albert to play the blessing. Lord,
Yep.
thank you for your words today. Lord, give us wisdom in applying this in our lives, that we may stand up for justice and righteousness, for the poor, the orphan, the widows. Lord, help us to be interceding or to give to them, Lord. Help us to be able to do the right thing by you. Father, we pray that you'll stir our hearts in aiding the poor, the orphan, the widow, and the oppressed. May we heed your voice, Lord. Yeah.
That's what the movie Sound of Freedom was all about.
Yeah, exactly.
Helping the helpless.
Let me ask Albert to conclude, and then we'll.
Lord bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. Lord bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. Amen. Lord bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace.
I can't do it. No, there you go. I cannot get it out today. Well, Happy New Year, everybody.
it's sympathizing with Albert.
Happy New Year. Going to
Happy
top.
New Year, and until next time. How's
Yeah.
that?
Till next time.
Shalom.
God bless you all.
Thanks.
Let me turn the recording off.